Hi, my sweet friends, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. Today we're reading from Heidi, chapter 23, Goodbye Till We Meet Again. Grandfather and the children were already outside with the goats when Peter came up with his flock one morning. He brought with him a letter from Grandmama. As he neared the group, his steps slackened. The instant he had handed the letter to Uncle, he turned quickly away as if frightened, and as he went, he gave a hasty glance behind him, and then with a leap he ran off up the mountain. "Grandfather," said Heidi, who had been watching him with astonished eyes, "why does Peter always behave now like the Great Turk when he thinks somebody is after him with a stick?" "Perhaps Peter fancies he sees the stick which he so well deserves coming after him," answered Grandfather. When Peter was well out of sight, he stood still and looked suspiciously about him. Suddenly, he gave a jump and looked behind him with a terrified expression, for he expected every minute that the police constable from Frankfort would leap out upon him from behind some bush or hedge. Mrs. Sessamon had written to say she would be up that very day. Heidi immediately set about straightening up the hut, for Grandmama must find everything clean and in good order when she arrived. So the morning soon went by, and Grandmama might now be expected at any minute. The children dressed themselves and went and sat outside on the seat ready to receive her. Grandfather came to show them the splendid bunch of blue gentians which he had been up the mountain to gather, and the children exclaimed with delight at the beauty of the flowers as they shone in the morning sun. Heidi jumped up from time to time to see if there was any sign of Grandmama's approach. At last she saw the procession winding up the mountain just in the order she had expected. First there was the guide, then the white horse with Grandmama mounted upon it, and last of all the porter with a heavy bundle on his back, for Grandmama would not think of going up the mountain without a full supply of wraps and rugs. Nearer and nearer wound the procession. At last it reached the top, and Grandmama was there looking down on the children from her horse. She no sooner saw them, however, sitting side by side, than she began quickly dismounting, as she cried out in a shocked tone of voice, "Why is this? Why are you not lying in your chair, Clara? What are you all thinking about?" But even before she had got close to them, she threw up her hands in astonishment, exclaiming further, "Is it really you, dear child? Why, your cheeks have grown quite round and rosy. I should hardly have known you." She was hastening forward to embrace her granddaughter, when the two children slipped down from the seat and began walking toward her quite coolly and naturally. Laughing and crying, Grandmama ran to them and embraced first Clara, and then Heidi, and then Clara again, unable to speak for joy. All at once she caught sight of Uncle looking on smilingly at the meeting. She took Clara's arm in hers, overjoyed at the fact that the child could now really walk about with her, and went up to the old man. Letting go Clara's arm, she seized his hands. "My dear uncle, my dear uncle, how much we have to thank you for. It is all your doing. It is your care and nursing." "And God's good sun and mountain air," he interrupted her, smiling. "Yes, and don't forget the beautiful milk I have," put in Clara. "Grandmama, you can't think what a quantity of goat's milk I drink and how good it is." "I can see that by your cheeks, child," answered Grandmama. "I really should not have known you. You have grown quite strong and plump and taller, too. I never hoped or expected to see you look like that. I cannot take my eyes off you, for I can hardly yet believe it. But now I must telegraph without delay to your father in Paris and tell him he must come here at once. It will be the greatest happiness he has ever known. My dear uncle, how can I send a telegram? Have you dismissed the men yet?" "They have gone," he answered. "But if you are in a hurry, I will call Peter, and he can take it for you." Uncle went aside a little way and blew such a resounding whistle through his fingers that he woke a responsive echo among the rocks far overhead. He did not have to wait many minutes before Peter came running down, looking as white as a ghost, for he quite thought Uncle was sending for him to give him up. But Uncle simply gave him a paper with instructions to take it down at once to the post office at Dorfli. Peter went off with the paper in hand, feeling some relief of mind for the present. Meanwhile, Mr. Sessamon, who had finished his business in Paris, had also been preparing a surprise. Without writing to his mother, he got into the train one sunny morning and traveled that day to Basel. The next morning he continued his journey, for a great longing had seized him to see his little daughter, from whom he had been separated the whole summer. He arrived at Ragatz a few hours after his mother had left. When he heard that she had that very day started for the mountain, he immediately hired a carriage and drove to Dorfli. The climb up the mountain from Dorfli proved long and fatiguing to Mr. Sessamon. He went on, but still no hut came in sight. And yet he knew there was one where Peter lived halfway up, for the path had been described to him over and over again. There were traces of climbers to be seen on all sides. The narrow footpaths seemed to run in every direction, and Mr. Sesamon began to wonder if he was on the right one, and whether the hut lay perhaps on the other side of the mountain. He looked around to see if there was anyone in sight of whom he could ask the way, but there was not a soul to be seen. Mr. Sesamon stood still for a while to let the cool alpine wind blow on his hot face. Soon someone came running down the mountainside. It was Peter, with the telegram in his hand. He ran straight down the steep slope, not following the path on which Mr. Sesamon was standing. As soon as the gentleman caught sight of him, he beckoned to him. Peter advanced toward him slowly and timidly, with a sort of sidelong movement, as if he could move only one leg properly and had to drag the other after him. "Hurry up, lad," called Mr. Sesamon, and when Peter was near enough, "Tell me," he said, "is this the way to the hut where the old man and the child Heidi live, and where the visitors from Frankfurt are staying?" A low sound of fear was the only answer he received, and Peter turned and ran in such haste that he fell head over heels several times and went rolling and bumping down the slope, just as the chair had done, but Peter fortunately did not fall to pieces. Only the telegram came to grief, and that was torn into fragments and blown away. "How extraordinarily timid these mountain dwellers are," thought Mr. Sesamon to himself. After watching Peter's violent descent toward the valley for a few minutes, he continued his journey. Peter, meanwhile, with all his efforts, could not stop himself, but went rolling on and still tumbling head over heels at intervals in a most remarkable manner. But this was not the most terrible part of his sufferings at the moment, for far worse was the fear and horror that possessed him. He felt sure that the policeman had really come over for him from Frankfurt. He had no doubt at all that the stranger who had asked him the way was the very man himself. Just as he had rolled to the edge of the last high slope above Dorfli, he was caught in a bush and at last able to keep himself from falling any farther. He lay still for a second or two to recover himself and to think over matters. "Well done," said a voice close to Peter. "And which of you is the wind going to send rolling down tomorrow like a sack of potatoes?" It was the baker, who stood there laughing. He had been strolling out to refresh himself after his hot day's work, and had watched with amusement as he saw Peter come rolling over and over in much the same way as the chair. Peter was on his feet in a moment. He had received a fresh shock. Without once looking behind him, he began hurrying up the slope again. He would have liked best to go home and creep into bed, to hide himself, for he felt safest there. But he had left the goats up above, and Uncle had given him strict orders to hurry back, so that they might not be left too long alone. There was no help for it. He had to go back, and Peter went on, groaning and limping. He could run no more, for the anguish of mind he had been through and the bumping and shaking he had received were beginning to tell upon him. Shortly after he had met Peter, Mr. Sesamon passed the first hut, and so was satisfied that he was on the right path. He continued his climb with renewed courage, and at last, after a long and exhausting walk, he came in sight of his goal. There, only a little distance farther up, stood the grandfather's home, with the dark tops of the fir trees waving above its roof. Mr. Sesamon was delighted to have come to the last steep bit of his journey. In another minute or two he would be with his little daughter, and he was happy at the thought of her surprise. But the company above him had seen him approaching and had recognized him, and they were preparing something he little expected as a surprise on their part. As he stepped up on the space in front of the hut, two girls came toward him. One was tall, with fair hair and pink cheeks. She leaned on Heidi, whose dark eyes were dancing with joy. Mr. Sesamon suddenly stopped, staring at the two children, and all at once the tears started to his eyes. What memories arose in his heart! Just so had Clara's mother looked, with her fair hair and delicate pink and white complexion. Mr. Sesamon did not know whether he was awake or dreaming. "Don't you know me, Papa?" called Clara to him, her face beaming with happiness. "Am I so changed since you saw me?" Then Mr. Sesamon ran to his child and clasped her in his arms. "Yes, you are indeed changed. How is it possible? Is what I see true?" And the delighted father stepped back to look at her again, and to make sure that the picture would not vanish before his eyes. "Are you my little Clara? Really my little Clara?" he kept on saying, as he clasped her in his arms again, and again put her away from him, that he might look and make sure it was she who stood before him. Excuse me. And now Grandmamma came up, anxious for a sight of her son's happy face. "Well, what do you say now, dear son?" she exclaimed. "You have given us a pleasant surprise, but it is nothing in comparison to what we have prepared for you, you must confess." She gave her son an affectionate kiss as she spoke. "But now," she went on, "you must come and pay your respects to Uncle, who was our chief benefactor." "Yes, indeed, and to the little inmate of our own house, our little Heidi, too," said Mr. Sesamon, shaking Heidi by the hand. "Well, are you still well and happy in your mountain home? But I need not ask. No alpine rose could look more blooming. I am glad, child. It is a pleasure to me to see you so." And Heidi looked up with equal pleasure into Mr. Sesamon's kind face. How good he had always been to her! And that he should find such happiness awaiting up here on the mountain made her heart beat fast with gladness. Grandmamma now introduced her son to Uncle. While the two men were shaking hands and Mr. Sesamon was expressing his heartfelt thanks and boundless astonishment to the old man, Grandmamma wandered round to the back to see the old fir trees again. Here another unexpected sight met her gaze, for there under the trees, where the long branches had left a clear space on the ground, stood a great bush of the most wonderful dark blue gentians, as fresh and shining as if they were growing on the spot. She clasped her hands, enraptured with their beauty. "How exquisite! What a lovely sight!" she exclaimed. "Heidi, dearest child, come here. Is it you who have prepared this pleasure for me? It is perfectly wonderful." The children ran up. "No, no, I did not put them there," said Heidi, "but I know who did." "They grow just like that on the mountain, Grandmamma, only if anything they look more beautiful still," Clara put in. "But guess who brought those down today?" At this moment a slight rustling was heard behind the fir trees. It was Peter, who had just arrived. He had seen from a distance who it was standing beside Uncle in front of the hut, and he was trying to slip by unobserved. But Grandmamma had seen and recognized him, and suddenly the thought struck her that it might be Peter who had brought the flowers, and that he was now trying to get away unseen, feeling shy about it. "Come along, my boy. Come here. Do not be afraid," she called to him. Peter stood still, petrified with fear. After all he had gone through that day, he felt he had no longer any power of resistance left. All he could think was, "It's all up with me now." Every hair of his head stood on end, and he stepped forth from behind the fir trees, his face pale and distorted with terror. "Don't be afraid, my boy," said Grandmamma in an effort to put him at his ease. "Tell me now straight out without hesitation, was it you who did it?" Peter did not lift his eyes and therefore did not see at what Grandmamma was pointing, but he knew that Uncle was standing at the corner of the hut, fixing him with his gray eyes, while beside him stood the most terrible person that Peter could think of, the police constable from Frankfurt. Quaking in every limb and with trembling lips, he muttered a low, "Yes." "Well, and what is there dreadful about that?" said Grandmamma. Because it is all broken to pieces and no one can put it together again." Peter brought out his words with difficulty, and his knees knocked together so that he could hardly stand. Grandmamma went up to Uncle. "Is that poor boy a little out of his mind?" she asked sympathizingly. "Not in the least," Uncle assured her. "It is only that he was the wind that sent the chair rolling down the slope, and he is expecting his well-deserved punishment." Uncle was simply giving expression to the suspicion that he had had from the moment the accident happened. The angry looks which Peter had from the beginning cast at Clara, and the other signs of his dislike for what had been taking place on the mountain, had not escaped Uncle's eye. Putting two and two together, he had come to the right conclusion as to the cause of the disaster, and he therefore spoke without hesitation when he accused Peter. "No, no, dear Uncle," Grandmamma protested. "We will not punish the boy any further. We must be fair to him. Here are all these strangers from Frankfurt who come and carry away Heidi, his one possession, and a possession well worth having, too, and he is left to sit alone day after day for weeks with nothing to do but brood over his wrongs. No, no, let us be fair to him. His anger got the upper hand and drove him to an act of revenge, a foolish one, I own, but then we all behave foolishly when we are angry." And saying this, she went back to Peter, who still stood frightened and trembling. She sat down on the seat under the fir trees and called him to her kindly. "Come here, my boy, and stand in front of me, for I have something to say to you. Stop shaking and trembling, for I want you to listen to me. You sent the chair rolling down the mountain so that it was broken to pieces. That was a very wrong thing to do, as you yourself knew very well at the time. You also knew that you deserved to be punished for it, and in order to escape this, you have been doing all you can to hide the truth from everybody. But be sure of this, Peter. Those who do wrong make a mistake when they think no one knows anything about it. For God sees and hears everything, and when the wicked doer tries to hide what he has done, then God wakes up the little watchman that he places inside us all when we are born, and who sleeps on quietly till we do something wrong. And the little watchman has a small goad in his hand, and when he wakes up, he keeps on pricking us with it, so that we have not a moment's peace. And the watchman torments us still further, for he keeps on calling out, "Now you will be found out. Now they will drag you off to punishment." And so we pass our life in fear and trouble, and never know a moment's happiness or peace. Have you not felt something like that lately, Peter? Peter gave a contrite nod of the head, for Grandmama had described his own feelings exactly. "And you calculated wrongly also in another way," continued Grandmama, "for you see the harm you intended has turned out for the best for those you wished to hurt. Since Clara had no chair to go in, and yet wanted so much to see the flowers, she made the effort to walk, and every day since she has been walking better and better. If she remains up here, she will in time be able to go up the mountain every day, much oftener than she would have done in her chair. So you see, Peter, God brought good out of evil for those whom you meant to injure, and you who did the evil were left to suffer the unhappy consequences of it. Do you thoroughly understand all I have said to you, Peter? If so, do not forget my words, and whenever you feel inclined to do anything wrong, think of the little watchman inside you with his goad and his disagreeable voice. Will you remember all this?" "Yes, I will," answered Peter, still very subdued. He did not yet know how the matter was going to end, for the police constable was still standing with the uncle. "That's right, and now the thing is over and done for," said Grandmama. "But I should like you to have something for a pleasant reminder of the visitors from Frankfurt. Can you tell me anything that you have wished very much to have? What would you like best as a present?" Peter lifted his head at this and stared open-eyed at Grandmama. Up to the last minute he had been expecting something dreadful to happen, and now, instead, he might have anything that he wanted. His mind seemed all in a whirl. "I mean what I say," Grandmama assured him. "You shall choose what you would like to have as a remembrance from the Frankfurt visitors, and as a token that they will not think any more of the wrong thing you did. Now do you understand me, boy?" The fact began at last to dawn upon Peter's mind that he had no further punishment to fear, and that the kind lady sitting in front of him had delivered him from the police constable. He suddenly felt as if the weight of a mountain had fallen off him. He had also by this time awakened to the further conviction that it was better to make a full confession at once of anything he had done wrong or had left undone, and so he said, "And I lost the paper, too." Grandmama had to consider a moment what he meant, but soon recalled his connection with her telegram. "You are a good boy to tell me," she said kindly. "Never conceal anything you have done wrong, and then all will come right again. And now what would you like me to give you?" Peter grew almost giddy with the thought that he could have anything in the world that he wished for. He had a vision of the yearly fair at Mayenfeld with the glittering stalls and all the lovely things that he had stood gazing at for hours without a hope of ever possessing one of them. Peter's purse never held more than a cent, and all these fascinating objects cost more than double that amount. Peter stood lost in thought. He was trying to think whether he would rather have a red whistle or a knife. Then a bright thought occurred to him. If he had the money, he would be able to think over the matter between now and next year's fair. "A nickel," he answered, no longer in doubt. Grandmama could not help laughing. "That is not an extravagant request. Come here, then." And she pulled out her purse and put 5 bright, round half-dollars in his hand, and then laid a dime on the top. "We will settle our accounts at once," she said, "and I will explain them to you. I have given you as many nickels as there are weeks in the year, and so every Monday throughout the year you can have a nickel to spend." "As long as I live?" asked Peter quite innocently. Grandmama laughed still more at this, and the men, hearing her, paused in their talk to listen to what was going on. "Yes, my boy, you shall have it all your life. I will put it down in my will. Do you hear, my son? You are to put it down in yours as well, a nickel a week to Peter as long as he lives." Mr. Sesemann nodded his assent and joined in the laughter. Peter looked again at the present in his hand to make sure he was not dreaming, and then said, "Thank God!" and he went off running and leaping with even more than his usual agility, and this time managed to keep his feet, for it was not fear, but joy, such as he had never known before in his life, that now sent him flying up the mountain. All trouble had disappeared, and he was to have a nickel every week for life. After dinner, when the party were sitting together chatting, Clara drew her father a little aside and said with an eagerness that had been unknown to the little tired invalid, "Oh, Papa, if you only knew all that Grandfather has done for me from day to day. I cannot count his kindnesses, but I shall never forget them as long as I live. And I keep on wondering what I could do for him, or what present I could make him that would give him half as much pleasure as he has given me." "That is just what I want to do myself, Clara," replied her father, whose face grew happier each time he looked at his little daughter. "I have also been wondering how we can best show our gratitude to our good benefactor." Mr. Sesamon now went over to where Uncle and Grandmamma were engaged in lively conversation. Taking Uncle by the hand, he said, "Dear friend, you will believe me when I tell you that I have known no real happiness for years past. What were money and property worth to me when they could not make my poor child well and happy? With the help of God, you have made her whole and strong, and you have given new life not only to her, but to me. Tell me now, in what way can I show my gratitude to you? I can never repay all you have done, but whatever is in my power to do is at your service. Speak, friend, and tell me what I can do." Uncle had listened to him quietly, with a smile of pleasure on his face as he looked at the happy father. "Mr. Sesamon," he replied in his dignified way, "believe me that I too have my share in the joy of your daughter's recovery, and my trouble is well repaid by it. I thank you heartily for all you have said, but I have need of nothing. I have enough for myself and the child as long as I live. One wish alone I have, and if that could be satisfied, I should have no further care in life." "Speak, dear friend, and tell me what it is," begged Mr. Sesamon. "I am growing old," Uncle said, "and shall not be here much longer. I have nothing to leave the child when I die, and she has no relatives except one person who will always like to make what profit out of her she can. If you could promise me that Heidi would never have to go and earn her living among strangers, then you would richly reward me for all I have done for your child." "There could never be any question of such a thing as that, my dear friend," said Mr. Sesamon quickly. "I look upon the child as our own. Ask my mother, my daughter. You may be sure that they will never allow the child to be left in anyone else's care. But if it will make you happier, I give you my hand upon it. I promise you, Heidi shall never have to go and earn her living among strangers. I will make provision against this both during my life and after. But now I have something else to say. The child is totally unfitted to live a life away from home. We found that out when she was with us, but she has made friends, and among them I know one who is at this moment in Frankfurt. He is winding up his affairs there, that he may be free to go where he likes and take his rest. I am speaking of my friend the doctor, who came over here in the autumn, and who intends to settle in this neighborhood. So you see, the child will from now on have two protectors near her, and may they both live long to share the task." "God grant, indeed, it may be so," added Grandmamma, shaking Uncle's hand warmly as she spoke. Then, putting her arm around Heidi, she drew the child to her. "And I have a question to ask you too, dear Heidi. Tell me if there is anything you particularly wish for." "Yes, there is," answered Heidi promptly, looking up delightedly at Grandmamma. "Then tell me at once, dear, what it is." "I want to have the bed I slept in at Frankfurt, with the high pillows and the thick coverlet, and then Grandmother will not have to lie with her head downhill, hardly able to breathe, and she will be warm enough under the coverlet not to have to wear her shawl in bed to prevent her freezing to death." In her eagerness to obtain what she had set her heart upon, Heidi hardly gave herself time to get out all she had to say, and did not pause for breath till she reached the end of her sentence. "Dearest child," answered Grandmamma, moved by Heidi's speech, "what is this you tell me of Grandmother? You are right to remind me. In the midst of our own happiness, we forget too often that which we ought to remember before all things. When God has shown us some special mercy, we should think at once of those who are denied so many things. I will telegraph to Frankfurt at once. Miss Rottenmeier shall pack up the bed this very day, and it will be here in 2 days' time. God willing, Grandmother shall soon be sleeping comfortably upon it." Heidi skipped around Grandmamma in her glee, and then stopping all of a sudden, she said quickly, "I must hurry down and tell Grandmother." They all decided to go down to see the grandmother, but before they started, Mr. Sesamon told them his plans. He had been arranging that he and his mother should make a little tour in Switzerland, taking Clara with them as far as she was able to go. But now that he could take his little daughter all the way, he wanted to start at once. And so he proposed that he and his mother should spend the night in Dorfli, and that the next day he should come and get Clara. Then they would all three go down to Ragaz and make that their starting point. Clara was rather upset at first at the thought of saying goodbye like this to her friends on the mountain. She could not help being pleased, however, at the prospect of the journey. Grandmama took Heidi by the hand, and they led the way down the mountain. Uncle came next, with Clara in his arms, for she could not yet walk that far. Mr. Sesemann brought up the rear. Brigida saw the company approaching and rushed indoors. "The whole party of them are just going past, Mother, evidently all returning home again," she informed the old woman. "Uncle is with them, carrying the sick child." "Alas, is it really to be so, then?" sighed the grandmother. "And you saw Heidi with them? Then they are taking her away. If only she could come and put her hand in mine again. If I could but hear her voice once more." At this moment the door flew open, and Heidi sprang across to the corner and threw her arms around Grandmother. "Grandmother! Grandmother! My bed is to be sent from Frankfurt, with all the 3 pillows and the thick coverlet. Grandmama says it will be here in 2 days. Heidi could not get out her words quickly enough, for she was impatient to see Grandmother's great joy at the news. The old woman smiled, but she said a little sadly, "She must indeed be a good, kind lady, and I ought to be glad to think she is taking you with her, but I shall not outlive it long." "What is this I hear? Who has been telling my good grandmother such tales?" exclaimed a kindly voice, and Grandmother felt her hand taken and warmly pressed. Grandmama had followed Heidi in and heard all that was said. No, no, there is no thought of such a thing. Heidi is going to stay with you and make you happy. We want to see her again, but we shall come to her. We hope to pay a visit to the Alm every year, for we have good cause to offer up a special thanks to God upon this spot where so great a miracle has been wrought upon our child." And now Grandmother's face was lighted up with genuine happiness, and she pressed Mrs. Sesamann's hand over and over again, unable to speak her thanks, while 2 large tears of joy rolled down her aged cheeks. "How many, many other good things God has sent me," said the grandmother, deeply moved. "I did not think it possible that there were so many kind people, ready to trouble themselves about a poor old woman and to do so much for her. Nothing strengthens our belief in a kind Heavenly Father who never forgets even the least of his creatures so much as to know that there are such people, full of goodness and pity for a poor, useless creature such as I am." "My good grandmother," said Mrs. Sesemann, interrupting her, "we are all equally poor and helpless in the eyes of God, and we all have equal need that he should not forget us. But now we must say goodbye, but only till we meet again, for when we pay our next year's visit to the Alm, you will be the first person we shall come and see. Meanwhile, we shall not forget you." And Mrs. Sesemann took Grandmother's hand again in farewell. Mr. Sesemann and his mother continued their journey down, and while Uncle carried Clara back home, Heidi ran along beside him, so full of joy of what was coming for Grandmother that every step was a jump. But there were many tears shed the following morning by the departing Clara, who wept to say goodbye to her friends and the beautiful mountain home where she had been happier than ever in her life before. Heidi did her best to comfort her. "Summer will be here again in no time," she said, "and then you will come again, and it will be nicer still, for you will be able to walk about from the beginning. We can go out every day with the goats up to where the flowers grow and enjoy ourselves from the moment you arrive." Mr. Sesemann arrived to take his little daughter away, and Clara, somewhat consoled by Heidi's words, turned to her little friend. "Be sure you say goodbye for me to Peter and the goats, and especially to Little Swan. I wish I could give Little Swan a present, for she has helped so much to make me strong." "Well, you can if you like," replied Heidi. "Send her a little salt. You know how she likes to lick some out of Grandfather's hand when she comes home at night." Clara was delighted at this idea. "Oh, then I shall send 100 pounds of salt from Frankfurt, for I want her to have something as a remembrance of me." Mr. Sesemann now beckoned to the children that it was time to be off. Grandmama's white horse had been brought up for Clara, and the little girl proudly rode off beside her father. Heidi ran to the far edge of the slope and continued to wave her hand to Clara until horse and rider disappeared. And now the bed has arrived, and Grandmother is sleeping so soundly all night that she is sure to grow stronger. Grandmama, moreover, has not forgotten how cold the winter is on the mountain. She has sent a large package of warm clothing of every description so that Grandmother can wrap herself round and round and will certainly not shiver with cold now as she sits in her corner. There is a great deal of building going on at Dorfli. The doctor has arrived and for the present is occupying his old quarters. He has bought the old house that Uncle and Heidi live in during the winter. The doctor is having part of the old house rebuilt for himself and the other part repaired for Uncle and Heidi. The doctor knows that Uncle is a man of independent spirit who likes to have a house to himself. Quite at the back, a warm and well-walled stall is being put up for the 2 goats, and there they will pass their winter in comfort. The doctor and Uncle are becoming better friends every day. As they walk about the new buildings to see how they are getting on, their thoughts continually turn to Heidi, for the chief pleasure to each in connection with the house is that they will have the light-hearted little child with them there. "Dear friend," said the doctor on one of these occasions as they were standing together, "you will see this matter as I do, I am sure. I share your happiness in the child, as if, next to you, I was the one to whom she most closely belonged. I wish also to share all responsibilities concerning her and to do my best for the child. I shall then feel I have my rights in her and shall look forward to her being with me and caring for me in my old age, which is the one great wish of my heart. She will have the same claims upon me as if she were my own child, and I shall provide for her as such, and so we shall be able to leave her without anxiety when the day comes that you and I must go." Uncle did not speak, but he clasped the doctor's hand in his, and his good friend could read in the old man's eyes how greatly moved he was, and how glad and grateful he felt. Heidi and Peter were at this moment sitting with Grandmother. Heidi had so much to tell, and the others to listen to, that they all 3 got closer and closer to one another, hardly able to breathe in their eagerness not to miss a word. It was difficult to say which of the 3 looked the happiest at being together again, and at the recollection of all the wonderful things that had happened. Then at last the grandmother spoke. "Heidi, read me one of the hymns," she said. "I feel I can do nothing for the remainder of my life, but thank the Father in heaven for all the mercies he has shown us." That's the end of our story. Tomorrow we'll start with Robin Hood. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.